Right. Well, I'm really, really pleased to be here with one of my favourite people on the planet. I'm not just saying that because you're here. Ezri Carlebach, good to see you, my friend. Are you good?
Good to see you too, yes.
And I'm hoping that I'm actually in shot. Like you see, anyway, we won't worry people with all those technical things, but tell me a little bit about your background, communication. There's a bit of academia and a bit of music also in your background. Tell us in a snapshot a little bit about your background.
Okay, well, I started out in the music business. I was an itinerant bass player for 10 years.
Right.
I call myself now a writer and recovering bass player.
Right. Were you in a band or in?
Yeah, in lots of bands.
See, I didn't know that. I knew you played music, but I didn't know you were in bands and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I played the double bass and I did a lot of jazz and blues music but anything that.
Yeah. And you toured and
toured. Did lots of TV and radio and a lot of the college and club circuit we're talking the late 70s and early 80s.
Wow.
That gives away my age a little bit, but
fantastic. Well, that must have been a dream. How old were you at the time?
I started as a teenager, and it was fantastic at the time, and I had no attachments, and I was, happy travelling around and being in the back of a transit van at all hours of the day and night, and that sort of thing.
And that must have been really cool. I mean, it's so many people who's young's dream to do that. Yeah. But I get the feeling you're a bit from an academic background. So how did that sit when you could probably walk down different paths?
It's a very interesting question because what happened was I began to get more and more interested in ideas. I love music, still love music, but ideas became very important.
Right.
I started to read a lot more widely than I was ever encouraged to at school, interestingly.
Yeah.
And I had a sort of Sartori enlightenment moment in the back of a transit van, I don't know, on the M1 in the middle of the night, and I was reading Kafka, and the guys in the band were, should we say, slightly dismissive, and I thought, maybe now's the time to do something different.
Right.
So I got enrolled at Birkbeck and did a degree in the evenings whilst I started working in publishing, and my sort of big intro to communications was really working on primary research journals, and that taught me a lot about the importance of consistency, about the importance of quality in writing and accuracy, because it was psychology journals, but they kind of counted scientific.
Right, okay.
So, the criteria that apply in scientific, technical and medical publishing are applied to those journals, and it was very rigorous, and that gave me a fantastic grounding. And I subsequently went on to work in the higher education sector, in the arts and culture sector, and in the financial services sector, as we've talked about previously.
You worked from places as diverse as Barclays to
the Royal Society of Arts, and the Association of Commonwealth Universities, and places like that.
And here we are. Tell us a little bit about where we are for all the people who want to look at the noise and the
buzz around here is we're in. It's called the Street. It's a sort of main corridor in the brand new Central St Martin's building at the King's Cross development. Central St Martin's is, of course, now a constituent college of the the University of the Arts, London, and that's where I'm now currently working.
Right, so let's talk a little bit about communications, and I guess what's interesting is that I guess everything's communication, isn't it? Music is communication, and you talked a little bit about studying around communication, became more and more interested in words and ideas and so on. And now, whatever types of organisations you work with, they all need to communicate different kind of different kind of messages, and I guess that communication is probably more important than ever because there are more modes of communication than ever. We all walk around with mobiles and tablets and all the rest of it. More and more organisations are keen to get our money or keen for us to experience what it is that they experience. What for you is communications actually about as a discipline? Is it about spreading the word of an organisation? Is it about having a dialogue with people? Is it about what is it for you?
Yeah, I think dialogue is the key word, and the metaphor that I always come back to in communication is conversations.
Yes.
Because there's been a paradigm shift, largely driven by social media, but was kind of going on anyway from the sort of late 90s as transparency became a big issue for organisations. So organisations were communicating with their own people, with customers, with governments, and so on. Transparency became a very big issue, and it became less about this is our message, we must push it to those people, and became much more about, okay, we need to have a conversation, we need to have a dialogue. We need to understand their position as much as we want them to understand ours.
And I guess that this is where it becomes really, really interesting, isn't it? And this theme about conversations is really dear to my heart. It's one of the things I talk about in the book, and I'm so glad you talk about this thing about conversations. I guess it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because sometimes we feel as customers that, particularly when it comes to like politically, we kind of feel, okay, you know, be it your local council has got to go through a consultation exercise, or people, you know, trying to get people on board in terms of politically. We often feel, well, hang on a minute, well, I'm kind of feel as I'm being conversed at rather than I'm genuinely a stakeholder in that kind of conversation.
And to be a stakeholder in the conversation, you have to be heard as well.
Right.
And for an organisation, what becomes a challenge is to demonstrate that it's listening. But the critical difference with social media as a kind of driving force behind this is that, in the words of Ewan Semple, who wrote a book called "Organisations Don't Tweet, People Tweet."
Yeah.
You know, so if you're getting into the social media side and you're getting into these new ways of communicating with employees or customers or other stakeholders, there has to be a fundamental degree of solidarity with the person or the people you're engaging with. Otherwise, it's not a genuine conversation.
Right. And this is really interesting what you're saying here about this, and when you mention things, for example, like social media, because I think that obviously social media is still very, very new, and from an organisational perspective, whilst many organisations are doing it, lots of them really struggling about why they're doing it, how they should be doing it, who should be doing it, whether you have just an organisational voice or individual people's kind of voices. And lots of people still see these modes as something that is just purely social and a little bit, why on earth are we doing it? But I think that you're saying that actually these things are really, really important as a way to actually make sure that there is a real flow, a real dialogue.
And I think there's a danger that companies go around setting up social media departments and then say, okay, you're the social media department, you do that like you have a media relations department or a web department. And that is not how it works. The whole community needs to be involved, whether it's a company or a non-profit organisation or whatever, needs to be involved in this kind of conversation. And it's I think, symptomatic of a shift in the way that organisations are using communication strategically. The holy grail for communicators a while back was to get a seat at the table and to be taken seriously as a strategic function and be in the board and at board level. But actually it's becoming apparent that whilst that may be desirable from some perspectives, actually communication is a fundamental human competence. And so all the people in an organisation must and need to communicate and therefore need to be involved in the conversations. So in a way, I'm arguing against having a formal communications structure, although clearly that's still necessary for other reasons. But it is important that the emphasis has shifted more towards this idea of communication being a core business competence.
And I think that what you're saying is really interesting, because it makes me think that the whole way in that we think about communication, really we do need to we really need to look at it in a way of fresh or far more deeply. I'm just thinking again back to when we started our conversation around something like music. We've seen a huge shift in the way that artists, perhaps for the first time, can really engage with their fans. And when you talk about things like social media and tweeting and so on, we see the power of it there. And being able to, the people can perhaps even independently of record companies have a lot of power, be able to really engage with people and really develop that kind of relationship. Are people in those kind of fields ahead of the mark in terms of where organisations are in terms of how they can really harness social media and different ways of communicating with people in a way that's very, very powerful and profound, and that allows them to really explore what their customers really need and to develop new things or to really serve them?
I think that's right, and I think people are observing now what happened to the music industry in the early days of the digital environment has sort of shifted to the publishing industry as we get more and more Kindles and that we download more books and it becomes more digital. And nobody's quite sure which is the next industry that's going to have its whole business model completely, inverted, if you like, by these new media. And I think that that's an inevitable process, but at the same time, older ways of communicating remain valid. So bands still go out and do gigs, and that immediacy and connection with an audience is irreplaceable. even though they can reach people in every part of the globe through the web and other media, that building of relationships is still important. And the same is true for an organisation with any kind of product or service.
So with organisations then now, where organisations think, okay, yeah, we know we need to communicate, and we've invested in communication, we've had a communications team, and we are aware of these new forms of communication and so on. But I guess that one of the challenges for many organisations, particularly in this climate, is that the economic climate is so tough that very often there's the pressure just to get messages out. Is there a challenge with being able to actually genuinely create the space or the time to have a dialogue? What's your take on that? What organisations who feel, yeah, we know we need to be doing this and we do some of it internally, but how do, we can't easily...
Yeah, I mean the resources are always a challenge, and organisations, that's a sort of key part of any strategic function, is to marshal your resources effectively, and you have to prioritise and decide what's most important in your particular circumstances. That's not going to change regardless of other things. But what you were saying there really reminded me of something that I've discovered recently, for personal reasons, that's had a profound effect, and that's the power of simply being in the present bit. Organisations are always either looking back to the past or saying, right, what are we doing next year? What's the plan? Where are we going? And people and organisations, which are just collections of people after all, forget to be in the present. And through a very simple mindfulness practice, I've been learning to be in the present a bit more. And as a means of communicating, it's very, very powerful, because it makes you focus on what's out there and what's in you and how those things interact. And after all, that's what communication should be about. Instead of thinking my agenda, what's next?
I think that's so right. I think what you're saying is so powerful, and actually that's the point where we can actually influence. Because I guess from an organisation's point of view and so on, what we're really trying to do is really connect and influence. And actually you can only do that, whether it's you're talking about a team, whether it is that you're talking about with customers, if you are present and if you actually really listen. So I think what you bring to the table is just how fundamental that is, and how everything else just becomes noise unless one is actually present, be it a manager in their team, be it what have you. And so what's been your own personal, what's your own approach to that then, personally and professionally then, communicating from that space of the present?
I think it links to another major trend in the communications profession, which is to focus more on helping people to develop their own communication competencies. So you get a lot of people who become senior communicators find themselves basically being business coaches and coaching executives on communication, and now that's becoming part of the repertoire at all levels of sort of communications profession. And that then inevitably, because coaching, as you know, is on a spectrum that links into mentoring, and mentoring is very much more about enabling people to solve their own problems and less about directing them on what to do. So as a manager, that's what I'm always seeking to do now, to see how far can I go along that spectrum so that the people I'm working with solve their own problems.
Well, I think what you're saying is really interesting, because this brings it to something that's very, very real. I remember that once doing a piece of work with you at a particular environment where there's a lot of change that lots of people who are actually listening to this might be mindful of, where there's restructure changes, some people will be leaving organisations, so much is happening everywhere. But one of the things that I quite like that you did was that you were really able to, and personally, the stuff that we talked about being present, genuinely empathising and genuinely having a conversation involving the people in the room in terms of what was going on, and so they genuinely were stakeholders. And actually what was really interesting about that day is that the mood in the room was actually quite a jolly one, actually, in a way, despite the fact that some people might be leaving or what have you. And this is the power of that. You know, it's interesting, I'm just thinking about, I was with a client yesterday, a completely different environment, she runs a business and she was thinking about where she was going, and I was just inviting her to be very present for her to be able to articulate what's really important to her. And when she did, she realised that she was far closer, literally and metaphorically, to that than she had thought, by being able to articulate where she was actually at. So I think what you're saying is so powerful, because I'd imagine within organisations, so many people feel that they're just genuinely not heard. And also externally, customers often feel as though they're not being heard. So what you're talking about there's actually a real practical and commercial win from just being present and really hearing actually what your customers actually think, what they feel, what's really important to them. I guess the challenge here for organisations is to require courage. Is that?
It does require courage. It requires trust more than anything. And it never ceases to amaze me that organisations hire people, take them into their kind of family, pay them money, and then don't trust them. And I think that's something that's really a reminder of the sort of industrial model of labour relations and that whole side of things. And it's old-fashioned and ultimately it's counterproductive.
And so,
don't get me wrong. People do bad stuff. People do bad stuff within organisations, to each other, to the organisation, and that has to be managed. But there's still a fundamental issue about whether or not you trust your own people. And from a customer perspective, if you get any hint of the lack of trust between an organisation and its people, how does that make you feel as a customer or a potential customer? It's not great.
I see what you're saying. So there's a number of themes that you're talking about. When you brought to our attention, for example, the nature of social media, meaning and that actually people are wanting, that they want to engage far more in the round.
Yeah.
And that, for many organisations, mean that a number of the individuals within the organisation should be communicating. It's not just purely up to one function, even though there may well be a function within that organisation. Obviously, there are going to be challenges within that. But you're actually saying if organisations genuinely trust their people and support and nurture people, then that's going to be able to happen in a way that's very, very powerful and very profound. And I guess, it's really interesting what you're saying, because what you're saying, in a way, isn't that radical. Because I remember that back in the early days of my career, that I remember one of the most very powerful things that one of my first bosses did was recognise what I was good at and allowed me to be responsible for that within the organisation. And I was allowed to, speaking to lots of different stakeholders, and where there's that trust, well, everybody in the organisation actually should be an advocate for that organisation. I think that's what you're also pointing to, isn't it? That therefore the win from this is that you've got staff that are everybody in the organisation is an ambassador for the organisation, communicating what the organisation is about. Requires trust, requires certain core messages, but it allows, I guess it allows all sorts of possibilities that I guess we may not necessarily have seen.
It does. I think we're beginning to see them. We're beginning to see them in some of the newer types of industries and companies that are emerging.
Right. Tell me organisations that you, if you want to, that you feel are doing interesting things when it comes to communications. Are there particular organisations or businesses or types of places?
I think that the design industry is doing some really interesting things. I'm not going to pick out any specific individual companies, but as a sector, the creative economy, I think, is leading the way in this kind of application. But there are some very progressive companies in more traditional sectors, if you like, who are also doing great stuff. And I think it is that combination of the courage that you mentioned, the willingness to trust and be trusted. I think this may sound political. It's not. It has a political connotation, but it's not meant to be. The concept of solidarity and stakeholder relationships, I think, really is important.
So, what's your messages before we close, to organisations? Because I guess one of the things that will be really encouraging for lots of people to hear is that somebody who works very senior in lots of organisations is talking about this far more open way of genuinely connecting, genuinely passing a message, genuinely engaging with customers and so on. What's your messages to any organisation and your tips for them to how it is that they can communicate in this new environment that we're in? What would you say to them, mindful of course that they've got to keep the board happy or shareholders happy and they're trying to compete in a change? What would you say are the key things that they should be doing, and what the wins from exploring? It's just very general.
I think you're right. You have to keep the sort of institutional processes managed appropriately. So I'm not suggesting you do away with corporate affairs departments and investor relations departments or anything like that. But you have to look at the whole organisation and say everybody is communicating. And when you make that step, you can then say if everybody's a communicator, because there's no question people see the correlation between effective communication and leadership, then you can really say, okay, everybody can be a leader at their level. And that's how you can release the potential that groups of human beings can demonstrate in any setting, whether it's climbing a mountain together against all the odds, or bringing a new product to market, or educating young people in creative subjects or in anything else. It's recognising that you need leaders at every level, and the best way to develop that is by simply saying everybody is a communicator, and then doing whatever is necessary to support that capability.
Wonderful, that sounds really wonderful, and I guess it's at last in a movement away from just trying to command and control, and really that you're actually trying to really impact and really cooperate on what an organisation, by the name of it, should actually be about. Well, and tell me then, what's lovely about what you're saying is that, just before we close, I guess that this relates to everything, doesn't it? You know, talking about on a personal, it relates to everything in any interaction. You know, two people, friends, and people in the day-to-day stuff. That I guess the invitation is that actually people are able to have the space where they actually can communicate freely and more happily and more respectfully. Are you?
If the conversation is the basic metaphor now for organisational communication as well as interpersonal communication, think about what that involves. If you're having a conversation with somebody else, how genuine is that conversation? And that will depend a lot on how much each party is willing to listen, how much common ground you can quickly establish, and all the sorts of things that, you know, if you walk into the famous analogy of walking into a cocktail party and figuring out who to talk to and then maintaining that conversation, but also recognising that the conversation will have a natural end and then you go off and talk to somebody else. So it's those kinds of attributes multiplied 1,000 times or whatever in the course of an organisational structure that can make a difference now, and that's the way that actually the world is beginning to look at the interactions within organisations, between organisations and their customers externally and each other.
And it means that actually there's far more chance that whatever level you're looking at, you can actually make some serious progress. So I imagine, just to close, is that I'd imagine that it must be quite an exciting time then to be in your field, or to have that take. I guess it's quite exciting that actually there's an opportunity as a communicator, and I know you're, from writing to everything else, you're passionate about. Do you feel quite optimistic that this is quite a time where people who are communicators or passionate about communication can actually play a real big role in helping us to develop and as we walk along this path?
I think there is plenty of grounds for optimism. There are always challenges, but I think the basic principle of sort of upgrading communications is a core competence for people right through from nursery education to higher education and into the workplace, I think can only be a good thing.
Wonderful, it's been a real pleasure, and I know I've got to let you set off your meeting because I've kept you late, but a real pleasure, and I'm going to turn off the camera. Thank you so much for your words and your wisdom and your warmth. Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you.